Good morning. Welcome to Augsburg University and the 30th Annual Nobel Peace Prize Forum in Minneapolis. It is our great honor and privilege to celebrate, to learn from, and to engage with those recognized by the Norwegian Nobel Committee for their work in promoting peace and justice around the globe. Each year, this forum gathers laureates, along with a host of other world leaders, innovative thinkers, and change agents to engage in the ongoing work of peacemaking. This work is near and dear to Augsburg and its partners as institutions committed to the work of realizing more fully the vision of a more just and peaceful world. This year's theme, the paradox of peace, seems particularly timely for the times in which we live. Out of our Lutheran Christian faith tradition, which has shaped Augsburg and many of our partner institutions, the concept of paradox reminds us that, in fact, paradox can be a place that stops you from working, but it can also be a place of great creative tension where, in fact, we are inspired and challenged to go on. What we will hear over the next couple of days is from many speakers, those who are working across the globe, in fact, to go on through the paradox of peace, to live into the tension, and to do the good work of just peacemaking. This morning, we celebrate and honor the work of the 2016 Peace Prize laureate, President Juan Manuel Santos, who played a pivotal role in the negotiations leading to the Havana Peace Accord that ended the 55-year civil war in Colombia. It is our great pleasure to have with us here today two representatives from Colombia, Representative Claudia Lopez and Father Leonel Narvaez, as well as the president of the U.S. Institute of Peace, Nancy Lindberg, to help us understand the factors that led to this historic agreement, the challenges that lie ahead, and the role that Friends of Colombia can play in fully realizing the terms of the peace accord. Tomorrow, we will explore the daunting task of ridding the world of nuclear weapons and recognize the work of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and their advocacy for the landmark Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons passed by the United Nations last year. As we begin this forum, we pause now to acknowledge that we reside here on land originally inhabited by the Dakota peoples. Please welcome now Shante Maza, Dakota language faculty member at the University of Minnesota, who will give a welcome and blessing for this year's forum.
Hamitakepi. Hampet tu kinde wasna chante washterna pe chuza pedo. Dakodia chante mazi ish machbia chanduhupa hemye. Bedo wakantwa Dakota hemachak ame mini wakawayanke hecha oma pedo. Atewe Dakota ka yinawa ye khakhatwa hecha. Hampet tu kinde uya wanji ded tak wanji makida ampetu de wahiktaga takutona na epekta chin heo. Ampetu kinde unshiaka iokpia wahido. So I say, hello, my relatives. In the Dakota way, we are all related. We are a part of the same creation. So I can only greet you as my relatives. And it is with a good heart that I greet each and every one of you today in a good way. My Dakota names are Chante Maza or Machbia Chanduhupa. And I am Bidawakantuan Dakota. And I'm enrolled up at the Spirit Lake Reservation in North Dakota. My reservation used to be called Devil's Lake, but we don't have a devil. That was brought over here. So my dad is Dakota. My mom is Ojibwe. And I was asked to come here and speak today and give the welcome. And first and foremost, you are on Dakota land. I know there is the illusion that this is United States land, but we signed a treaty with the United States government, and they did not uphold their end of the bargain. And if you know anything about treaties, if you back out of a treaty, things are supposed to go back to the way that they were. So we negotiated these treaties sometimes under duress, sometimes under gunpoint, sometimes to make peace, and it didn't quite work out. And so today, we say as Dakota people that we have not forgotten those treaties, and that anybody here that is not Dakota is actually illegally occupying this land. I just want to be clear about that, that we're not calling anybody illegal, okay? There is a big difference because, again, you are our relatives. So in the next couple days here, you're going to be talking about peace and weapons. And just wanted to give you a few thoughts on that from Dakota perspective. Dakota ekta dohanu taku anjion chimka han trokahia tronkashira cheonkya piktedo. Heon taku unchimpinaku taku tronkashira unkidap kiktehe. He echetuktedo. So as Dakota people, when we want something, when we really need something, the first thing that we do is we address the great unknown. You could say the great unknown, you could say God, you could say Allah, you could say Jehovah, whatever. Okay? So, and when we ask for those things, they will be given to us. Maybe not always the way that we think they're going to be, right? But one of those things is, I'm sure most of you know the word Dakota. If you say, Wo Dakota, that is our word for peace. See, it's built into our name because Dakota means friend or ally. And we've been portrayed in so many different ways in the movies, thanks John Wayne and to all those others. But really, we always have been and are proponents of peace and talking about how to get along with each other. And now, amongst many indigenous people around the world, we're talking about decolonization. And it's kind of a bit of a catchphrase, but basically, what are the ways that indigenous people and the colonizers, so the colonizers and the colonized, how can they work together to create a better future for the young ones, for the future generations? And it's very important because one of the things that indigenous people are asked to do, the term reconciliation is brought up a lot. I will say Dakota people here, we have nothing to reconcile. So we cannot be part of that process. It's the Euro-Americans who have that's their task. And at some point in the future, maybe we'll both come to the table and be able to talk about that. But peace, so Wo Dakota, or Dakodkchiapi is another one. Having that being allied with each other in a good way as relatives, as friends. And it doesn't have to be very complex at all. And about weapons, you know, Dakota ekta ehanachchi tohanu akichitaki hena. I guess in the old days, our Dakota warriors or soldiers, they met their opponent out on the field and they fought that other opponent. And I always want to share this because, you know, I teach history class as well as language. And my students are always floored by this, but this is a fact. We actually had wars here on the soil. We had battles, and there were battles and wars where nobody died because we're not expendable beings. In fact, we did something that in our way could be considered much worse. We went up and we had these coup sticks. And you would go up to your opponent or the enemy, and an individual might beat up the other guy pretty bad instead of killing him. Because again, we're not expendable. And that was seen as a very high honor. We touched the enemy. So I encourage you the next 2 days to think about wherever you're from, think about the indigenous people, think about their perspectives on what you're going to be talking about, because they have their own perspectives, And many of them, I'm sure, like Dakota perspective, is thousands of years old, as opposed to, this very young government. And anyway, I think I'll leave it right there. And in closing, there's a word a phrase that we have. We say, mitakuye owasin. That means all my relations, but what it's talking about is whatever I'm saying, I'm acknowledging all of creation. That includes the stars, the sun, you, the water, the two-leggeds, the people in the air, the birds, people in the water, the fish, everything in the universe. So, thank you.
We thank Shante Maza for those important words. It's my pleasure now to invite to the podium Asle Toje, who earlier this year transitioned from his role as research director of the Norwegian Nobel Institute to being the newest member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee. Dr. Toje's research interests are located at the intersection of security studies and European studies. Since graduating from Cambridge in 2006, he has published widely on European security and foreign policy and appears regularly on radio and television in Norway. In 2017 and 2018, he collaborated with Augsburg and the Foreign Policy Association on a series of dialogues on nuclear security and the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Asle Toje.
So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to welcome you all here to the Nobel Peace Prize Forum and bring the best greetings from the Nobel Committee in Oslo. We had a meeting last week, and I told them all about the exciting program we were going to have here in Minneapolis, and they were all sorry that they couldn't be here. So you have to settle with me. I'm really happy to see that there are so many young people here in the audience. Peace is a matter for the future generations. Don't forget, the young people in the audience, that the world here is yours. And I can only ask you to be industrious, to be brave, and above all, be kind. Since 1901, 131 laureates have received the Nobel Peace Prize, which is known as the most prestigious award in the world. And I believe it has reached this pinnacle due to the people who have received the prize. We're talking about people like Woodrow Wilson, Fridtjof Nansen, Dag Hammarskjöld, Desmond Tutu, Malala Yousafzai. All of these laureates have inspired and are inspiring. And some have been instrumental in bringing about peace. We are here today to listen to one such laureate, a laureate that is very close to my own heart. In my previous role as research director at the Nobel Institute, I worked closely with the committee in bringing about the research that led to the award of this Peace Prize. Juan Manuel Santos. When awarding the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016 to Juan Manuel Santos, President of Colombia, the Nobel Committee pointed out his resolute efforts to bring to an end a more than 50-year-old civil war. Over those years that the civil war went on, more than 220,000 people lost their lives. And the anguish caused in local communities is frankly beyond count or reckoning. Due to his ongoing engagement with the complex peace process in Colombia, President Santos could not be with us here this week. To provide some background on his work and accomplishments, and to hear him in his own words, we will start this morning's program with a short film interview with President Santos, produced by the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo. Our conversation and the keynote speakers, moderated by Marco Verman of the PRI's The World, will follow immediately after the film. Thank you so much.
Well, the meaning of peace goes far beyond the absence of war. Peace means peace with oneself, peace with your family, peace with your neighbors, peace among the communities, and peace among nations. And the common denominator is equality, tolerance, opportunities for all. We have been living so long in war, in armed conflict, that people, in a way, got accustomed to that. We have lived 3 generations in war, and we are not feeling the sufferings of other people, which is how I define compassion. We have lost our compassion. We need to recuperate the compassion in order to be a normal country. When I feel sad, when I feel alone, when I feel defeated, I go and I talk to the victims. I will tell you one anecdote with one victim. We were giving houses to the most poor people in very remote regions. And we were giving them to the displaced and to the victims. And there was this peasant who came, and I said to him, "Here's the keys for your new house." He never imagined that he was going to have a new house. And I said, "Well, you lost a leg because he had one leg. He just had one leg because a mine had taken away his other leg. That you can now enjoy with your family this new house." And he said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry to say that I also lost my family. I lost all of my kids, and I lost my wife." And I looked at him and I said, I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. There's very few families who can say that they have no relatives who have been victims. But the suffering that I have endured is also with people that I have had to send, for example, to war. When I was Minister of Defense or as President, to send my soldiers and then bring them back in a coffin, and I have to tell his wife or his kids, "I'm sorry, your son died or your father died because of this war." That hurts a lot and has hurt me a lot, and that also was a very important determinant of my decision to persevere in this objective. Nobody thought that what we're doing now in Colombia was possible. When I started this process, 95% of the people says, "Why do you do that? You are the most popular person in Colombia because you were very effective as a defense minister, making war. And making war is easy. Making peace is much more difficult." I would have not forgiven myself if at the end of my life I thought that I had the opportunity to bring peace to my people and I didn't take it. We have a very social, progressive agenda. That's why some people think I am a traitor, because I look towards the most vulnerable. But I think this is, and I try to tell my friends in the elite that, and I remind them of a phrase that President Kennedy used to repeat: "You cannot be rich if you're surrounded by poverty." I was not obliged to have this plebiscite. But I thought it was the correct thing again. If you're going to make such a big step, it's better to have the legitimacy of the approval of the people, even though I had the constitutional legal right to sign and implement the peace process. Everybody was against it. The FARC was against it, my political party was against it, everybody, but I persisted because I thought it was the correct thing. It backfired in the sense that we didn't win. The plebiscite was announced, the results, very, very small margin with the no vote winning. I immediately thought of something that I have tried to apply in my life and in my public life. Try to grasp the opportunity that this difficult situation offers you. And I immediately thought, if the yes had won by a small margin, the country would be in flames. Why don't you take this opportunity and try to build a better peace agreement with stronger support, and we will be better off than we were before the plebiscite. And that is exactly what I've been doing. All the effort that I've invested in this process, all the suffering, because it has been a very difficult process. My family was all crying, my colleagues were all crying, and I said, no, don't cry, let's see how we can get out of this better. And I think it was a blessing in disguise, to tell you the truth, because the results are going to be better than if we had won the plebiscite by a small margin. When you are at war, it's very easy to lead. It's black and white. Rally around me because I am one of the heroes that are right and everybody follows. Making peace is very different, and that has made me unpopular, I hope, for the time being, because people then realize that this was the correct thing to do. The Nobel Prize came like a God-given present at a very opportune time, because it was given in a moment where people had lost faith. People thought that the peace process was over. And I was just starting to sort of rally the forces around the new agreement. And the Nobel Prize gave me a tremendous push. It came exactly at the right moment. So I received this prize in the name of all Colombians, because it's Colombia that has been at war for so many years, but especially the victims are the ones that deserve the credit. They had taught me, for example, something that I didn't know before I started this process. I thought that the victims were going to be the most difficult ones, the ones that would not accept transitional justice, the ones that would be very hard on any concession that I would give to the FARC. And they taught me that I was wrong. The victims are the most generous one. They were very generous, very prone to accept reconciliation, to forgive. And this, for me, was a lesson of life. I think we are already in an irreversible path. There's no way back. I certainly hope so. And what we're trying to implement is the agreement as soon as possible. That's why after we lost the plebiscite, my objective is let's get a new agreement and implement it as fast as possible, because this gap and this uncertainty certainly goes against peace. For the people who voted no and for the people who voted yes, we all want peace. And we should unite and have a better peace. if we are united and we work all together to implement and construct the peace, our kids, our grandchildren would be much better off.
Please welcome to the stage the host of the BBC and Public Radio International's The World, Marco Werman, and this morning's panelists, Claudia Lopez, Lionel Narvaez, and Nancy Lindborg.
Good morning, and thank you for coming out. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here on this notable 30th edition of the Nobel Peace Prize Forum here in Minneapolis at Augsburg University. Paradox of Peace as a title, I kind of feel, especially for this session, for me anyway, is quite fitting. The one time I was in Colombia in 2009, I was reporting on a program that had been established by the Office of Reintegration for FARC rebels who had laid down their arms. It was called Canto Conmigo, and it was basically, if you can imagine, American Idol or MTV's The Real World meets decommissioned guerrilla fighters. Basically, they were lured out of the jungle with the promises of getting them reintegrated into society by music lessons and performing as an ensemble. It was a pretty remarkable program, and I just have this scene in my head at a shopping mall in Bogota where they were being introduced to the public, and they sang the song that they composed. These are former rebels who wrote the song. We're getting out of the trenches, they sang. We will fight for Colombia, our beloved land. So from fighting in the jungle and violence to standing on a stage at a shopping mall and singing these songs, to me was very paradoxical, but it also suggests to me the passion and the determination of former fighters to move on. So I want to just quickly give a thumbnail sketch line on our guests today, and then I'm going to ask them to kind of add to that and introduce themselves. Claudia Lopez, a senator from Colombia with the Green Party. To her left, Lionel Narvaez, whose work has focused on reconciliation and forgiveness in Colombia. His interpreter, in case we run into any linguistic problems, which I don't think we will. And on the far left, my far left, Nancy Lindborg, who's been in public service for a couple of decades, but most recently is the president of the United States Institute of Peace, which is an independent body founded by Congress to provide practical solutions for preventing and resolving violent conflict around the world. I just want to mention one thing before we get talking, just a kind of point of housekeeping. That is, for questions, they will be you will send them in on an app. I think you know the instructions for that. If you don't, it's in the guidebook. Following our discussion this morning, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions of the panelists. To submit questions, open your guidebook app and click on the feedback menu option. You will find a form for submitting questions for this morning's plenary. Just please try to keep the questions short and to the point, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So, hope that's clear. I wanted to start with basically three questions. Expand on who you are, what I said. You're a senator, for example, and what you do, but also what your own role has been in Colombia's peace process. And then just tell us one thing about yourself that will help us understand why this particular path to peace in Colombia is one that you've been invested in.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Well, I'm Claudia Lopez. I'm a Colombian citizen, former senator. I just finished my fourth term last July. Was vice presidential candidate with Sergio Fajardo as presidential candidate. And right now, I'm a graduate student in political science. That's basically what I am right now.
And a senator?
No longer senator.
No longer, okay.
No longer senator, fortunately. Well, I've been, fighting for peace and trying to build peace in Colombia since the last 30 years, since I'm a child, basically. And I think this is the way to go, definitely. We are the only country in the entire American continent which still have a civil war in the 21st century. Probably we're going to discuss why. But that's our biggest challenge, is to end that civil war and to be able to exclude the use of violence in politics or in social life in general. During the last 60 years, we have 10 different illegal groups fighting each other against the state and each other. 8 million victims, roughly 300,000 civilians killed. So it absolutely justifies why to fight for peace and why to build peace in Colombia. I was just looking at this morning, the last public opinion survey shows that 70% of Colombians think that our military force is able to defeat the guerrilla groups or the illegal groups we have. Though almost 60% of them, of the public opinion in Colombia, supports dialogue and negotiations to deal with them. We still have different illegal groups. The ELN is the last guerrilla group we're still dealing with. We have different drug trafficking groups, unfortunately, cartels of different kinds. And of course, just the public security issues that any other country will have in addition, or on top of that. We do have incredible people, passionate, challenged, who has been able to resist the war and to build peace in the last 30 years. We are the only country in the world who have made and negotiate 10 peace agreements in the last 35 years. That's quite a record.
That's a lot.
We demobilized through these peace agreements roughly 60,000 combatants, former combatants. We have built a whole set of state-led and also social-led institutions to reintegrate, to reconcile all these people. But at the same time, being such quite an achievement for our country, we are still the only country in the entire American continent dealing with this kind of civil war still. We are the only one who have guerrilla groups. That doesn't happen anywhere else in this continent. Though our recent achievement was that we were able to reach an agreement and demobilize the largest guerrilla group in history, which was the FARC. That was the FARC. So what we are going to talk here is why we were able to achieve such a goal, but at the same time, what are the paradoxes and challenges we have and we're dealing with right now.
Leonel Narvaez, maybe you can answer these questions, but I also know that you wanted to you've got a PowerPoint demonstration that you want to just spend a couple of minutes with. So in the interest of time, if you want to make a couple of comments and then go into your slideshow.
Okay. I'm Leonel. I'm from Colombia. I was born in the same place where the founder of the FARC group was born, and it's a place called Génova, Quindío, in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And I became a very good friend of Tiro Fijo, or Manuel Marulanda, the founder of FARC. And I participated in the previous negotiations with the FARC in San Vicente del Caguán. Of course, those negotiations failed, and I myself, I was very disappointed because supposedly I was an expert on conflict negotiation, and I totally failed. So I started studying, asking myself what was the main cause of the failure. And now I will tell you later, showing just 7 or 8 slides, what is my opinion on this regard. I'm here on behalf of the Fundación para la Reconciliación in Colombia, but also on behalf of Forgiveness International, which is our official representation here in the USA. So I think that's all for the time being.
You want to show the slides now?
Okay, yes.
But it's up to you.
I'll be happy. Yes.
Okay.
So there is a big paradox. Is a great lesson that we have learned in Colombia, that against the irrationality of violence, we have to propose the rationality of forgiveness. I would like to mention here an ancient proverb which says, before gluing, one must clean the two broken parts. And cleaning or cleansing is my expertise. My main thesis today, or hypothesis, is that our peace in Colombia, first of all, our peace in Colombia is a baby peace. We don't have even 2 years since we signed the agreements. And of course, with babies, you always have some surprises. And that's what's happening in Colombia with our peace. But peace is mainly made of 3 parts. And I would like to use the metaphor of the tree. The tree has a trunk. And the trunk of peace has to be the answer to the objective needs of people, mainly housing, employment, education, health, land. But peace also needs to have branches, leaves, flowers, fruits, and those environmental needs are what we call the truth, justice, reparation, guarantees of no repetition, democracy, human rights. But you know, there is a kind of underground need that normally we do forget. And it is what I call the subjective needs. How to transform anger, hate, urge for revenge. And my proposal is that we have to work on forgiveness and compassion and reconciliation. That's a crucial point for what we call sustainable peace. And if we do not answer, or if we do not find a proper solution to that underground and hidden need, peace might fail. There are 2 critical challenges for sustainable peace in Colombia. One is the culture of hate and revenge. Our culture is made of memories without future, somebody said. And we keep answering to that kind of memories with revenge. And we do make revenge so often that it sounds as if that's the only solution. Then the second challenge for Colombia is the political economy of hate. It refers to the capacity of not only political leaders, but mainly leaders who are able to sell anger and hate in order to gain votes and political power. And the amazing thing is that there are so many consumers of anger and hate. Then I would like to say that the political economy of hate comes from the elites. And the grassroots transform that political economy of hate into culture of revenge. And they kind of feed each other. As I said, mainly through a lot of consumers which are there still in Colombia. I was 11 years working with the guerrilla peoples, and these are unpublished photos that for the first time I'm showing you. If you notice, the guy at the end of the row is the founder of the guerrilla people. It's called Manuel Marulanda, alias Tiro Fijo. Then his followers, some of the campaments or the places where they normally stayed, which was the area where I was living for these 11 years. Very young people working with them. This was just a 12-year-old girl. They had a lot of entertainment and some music which normally portrays messages of revolution and hate also, sometimes love. This was a 13-year-old girl, Nancy. All these three girls and the man in the middle, they are already dead. They used to play together. They used to have rituals, rites or symbols for promoting their cause. And this, at certain moment, were the two big bosses of the FARC people. Both of them are also dead. So my main motivation is that anger and hate, which comes from above, goes to the roots, the grassroots, and this is what we have in Colombia. The main motivator of violence and homicides is mainly revenge and fights or disputes. The main problem in Colombia is not that we have guerrillas or that we have drug traffickers. The main problem is our culture of hate and revenge, and these are official data. So what I'm saying, and I'm finishing, that I'm saying that against this kind of political economy of hate and the culture of revenge, we have to propose the culture of forgiveness and reconciliation. I would like to state, as Mandela or Desmond Tutu used to say, no future without forgiveness. Thank you very much.
And finally, Nancy Lindborg, expand a little bit more on what you do and what it was like observing the peace process from Washington and the kind of support that Washington was giving.
Sure, thank you. Great to be here. Thank you for the slideshow. I just want to add, a wonderful mentor of mine, Landrum Bowling, also says that forgiveness requires letting go of all hope for a better past, which is a key part, I think, of the cultural issues that you're discussing. So I am currently the president of the United States Institute of Peace, and USIP was founded by Congress about 35 years ago, and actually by members of Congress who were themselves veterans of World War II and the Korean War. And one of the most powerful things I think that I heard President Santos say is that war is easy, but peace is very difficult. And these veterans in Congress agreed and decided that there needed to be additional capabilities within the US government to understand and to support real sustained peace. And USIP has been operating for the last 35 years. We are a part of government, but independent of any administration, and we are nonpartisan. USIP for the past 25 years has been very involved with supporting peace processes and truth and reconciliation efforts around the world, both in terms of researching what works, what doesn't work, helping to provide training, tool development for countries that are undergoing peace processes or attempting to end violent conflict. In Colombia, USIP has been involved for about a decade and a half, both with specific support for different organizations, and through a wonderful colleague of mine who sadly passed away last year, Ginny Bouvier, directly involved with supporting the peace process itself through supporting a women's mediation network and women's commissions and the subcommission on gender, the different ways that helped promote a more inclusive process based on what we know from research over the last several decades, that peace processes that are more inclusive have a much greater chance of being sustained and of being successful. So I am not a Colombian expert, but the United States Institute of Peace continues to work in support of Colombians who are trying to finalize the last peace accord with the ELN and to try to make the FARC accords actually go forward. So happy to talk more about comparatives and specifics, but that's who USIP is. I would just add, from my own background, I spent the last 25 years working in, around, and on conflict. But for me, the real pivotal moment was during the Kosovo War, when I was working on humanitarian assistance delivery. I was on the first convoy into Kosovo after the NATO bombing ended. And as we entered Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, people were emerging from their homes for the first time in 3 months, and many of whom had not had access to food or health care or water. And we were coming in with convoys of food. But what they really wanted was not so much the food, but they wanted to tell their stories. Many of them had pictures that they wanted to share. They wanted people to know what had happened. They wanted the truth, and they wanted justice. And that was a revelatory moment for me that put me on the pathway, not just of humanitarian assistance, but of understanding the importance of ending these kinds of conflicts with the kind of truth and justice and reconciliation as paramount. And we underinvest in enabling those processes to really be successful.
We'll get back to the issue of women, because I think it's an important one, especially as regards this peace process. But in order to kind of understand the peace process, I just want to bite off a little bit of history, because I think to understand why there had to be a peace process, I just want to go back and look at what happened before, what preceded it, and why this peace process is so extraordinary. So, Claudia, can you just briefly take us from the creation of these rebel groups in the mid-60s, the ELN, the EPL, in 64, the FARC in 66, the M19 in the early 70s. Why was all this happening, all these left-wing groups? What created that?
Well, that's quite a question, but let me put it in this context. From the 19th and 20th century, Colombia has had 3 critical moments, like critical junctures of civil wars and partial peace agreements. At the end of the 19th century, we have, through the 19th century, an accumulation of civil wars. Finally, sort of the conservative side of that fighting won at the end of the 19th century. And we have a very conservative right approach to building the state for 30 years. It brings peace, but it excludes partially the liberal side. Then it broke up in the 1930s, and the Liberal Party took national power and tried to maintain some sort of inclusion of both the conservatives and the liberals, but doing a very progressive land reform, political reform, economic reform, acknowledging social movements, labor movements, and so on and so forth. Until 1948, it broke up. They were not able to build a sort of national pact of social inclusion, economic inclusion, and political inclusion. So it reversed to civil war again, which was very crude and cruel. By that time, we have a fifth of the population we have now, and we have almost the same level and the same amount of civilians killed in the 1950s that we have in the 1990s, which is amazing, proportionally, which is just amazing. Yeah. So to end that sort of civil war between liberals and conservatives, they finally reached an agreement in 1957, the National Front, which was to say, okay, we're going to share power for 16 years, right? 50-50. We're going to share 4 years of power, national power of conservatives, then 4 years of liberals, and so on and so forth. But to be able to reach such an agreement, they exclude everybody else. Like other political affiliations and ideologies can exist. Formally, they were parity, but they have no representation whatsoever. And no option to win through elections political representation. So it was by excluding others. Those excluded ended up forming guerrilla groups, mainly liberal to left, ideologically based guerrilla groups. Some of them more liberal, some of them more left, some of them more communist, more Marxist, but through variation. So it's the result of the political exclusion and social exclusion.
Right.
Throughout the 20th and 21st century, Colombia has been one of the most unequal societies in the world, and it's just the second or third in the region.
And
So,
in the 70s, with the emergence of right-wing paramilitaries, there's also that going on in the
exactly.
drug
Now the
thing.
new ingredient,
Yeah.
the third critical juncture, is the 90s, I will say, 80s and 90s, because there are new actors, basically drug traffickers and right-wing paramilitary groups promoted by the state, military members, politicians, entrepreneurs, who use them, first of all, to defend themselves from the guerrilla groups. But also they realize very soon that if you have violence and power, and military power, you can use it for something less than to defend, but to attack, to grab land illegally, to increase their own wealth, to attack your political competitors. So the right-wing paramilitary groups ended up not being a defensive tool to the guerrilla groups, but actually an attacking tool to grab land, to go against your political enemies or social contradictors. And the drug trafficking boom. So everybody's involved in drug trafficking. Everybody, even the state, the paramilitary groups, the guerrilla groups, use the drug trafficking as a source of funding its own groups and its own war. And that's how we end up having 8 million victims. 8 million victims, 8 million people victim of this last third critical juncture of war.
And when you say victim, I mean they were either injured or they were brought into this war in some way or another.
They were basically,
financially, they were victims.
They were forcibly displaced.
Yeah.
Forcibly displaced people. More than 6 million people forcibly displaced.
It was the
from
largest
the rural areas. It was
internally
the largest
displaced problem in
exactly.
the world, I think.
Then massacres. Then they were robbed, their lands, their possessions. Their children were recruited. And 3,000 civilians were killed. So in the last 30 years, and that's what this sort of peace process is all about, it took us like 20 years in the post-National Front agreement for all these groups to be created and moved. And it has taken us 30 years, the last 30 years, to negotiate each one of them, or to break them down, to be able to come back to the levels of peace or violence, as you want to see it, that we have like 50 years ago. So it's quite costly, socially, economically, politically. And at this moment, I will say, we end up with the sort of the jewel in this war, which was demobilizing both the paramilitary groups, which was the biggest achievement of President Albert Uribe, and demobilize the FARC, which is the biggest agreement of the biggest achievement of President Juan Manuel Santos.
Right.
Now, in this last peace process, in dealing with the paramilitary groups and how to deal with the FARC, the national elites divided themselves, right? Which is to some extent good. Otherwise, we wouldn't make it the peace with the FARC. If we have to wait for all the political elites to agree in using peace agreements, probably we wouldn't have been able to demobilize the FARC. So now we have the traditional national elites and the new regional elites, which are led by Albert Uribe, divided in how to deal with the FARC, in how to recognize or go ahead with the FARC accords. We have a more stronger civil society who's mobilizing, and we have a new political leadership coming from the center-left, basically, who's fighting to build peace and to provide political change. It's sort of the context in which we are now.
So, Leonel Narvaez, I mean, where do you start to make peace? I mean, what's the first step to take when you have all these competing interests? I mean, you've got ELN, you've got other groups, you've got the FARC, there's a cocaine war, there are the paramilitaries. How did it start? I mean, who made the first move?
Yes, I think the lucky point of this history of war in Colombia was when we had President Santos and the leaders of the guerrillas who were able to understand that we could not go on just fighting with arms and armies. We had to go somewhere else beyond that, and it was very well described by one of the guerrillas leaders who said, "From now on, our arms will be only our words. And we are going to change the logics of the arms for the logic of our words." And therefore, they started these 4.5 years of negotiations. And as I said, we are still a baby peace. And out of the nearly 570 commitments on both sides, especially in particular from the government, we have only reached the 18–20% of achievement in applying the commitments that the government and the guerrilla have decided together. My main feeling here is that, and my thesis is that, unfortunately, there is still a lot of hate, not only in Colombia, I think also here. There is a lot of hate and urge for revenge in Colombia. Imagine that in the last 20 months of this negotiation, we have had nearly 450 social leaders killed. And you know, there has been an amazing way of killing them is through paid killers. We call them sicarios, paid killers, which are people, humble people, poor people who get some money to go and kill, but sent by somebody somewhere. That's what I say, this hate and urge for revenge, which comes from the elites, whether political, whether economical, whatever. And this is our real problem at this moment. We are really, all of us, we are really touched by how our social leaders are now being killed. And therefore, what I keep saying is that unless we try to transform or to overcome our urge for revenge, we will not be able to have sustainable peace. And this, I think, together with economic and social solutions and also juridical solutions, we need to find a way to transform the culture of revenge for a culture of reconciliation.
So that would seem to be one of the challenges right now. If you go back to when the peace process started, give us the nuts and bolts of what you were able to kind of do as a first step. Because there were so many starts and stops to peace talks with any number of guerrilla groups throughout the 70s and 80s, and they all fell apart. This one didn't. So why was this different? Claudia, any thoughts on that?
This peace agreement?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that, peace efforts starts from the civil society and the people who say, I'm not willing to allow anybody else to continue killing me impunitively, right? So people organize and pressure socially and politically. Say, hey, somebody has to protect me. If there is anything in this country that deserves the word state or government, they have to protect me. And so people organize and resist and move and press through elections and different processes. That's why peace starts. I mean, peace is not a concession of the government or the elites or of President Santos just simply saying, I'm going to make peace. That's a product, that's a byproduct of the social and political pressure of people from below. So that's one thing. And in the level of victimization that we have in the last 30 years, if you think that, 8 million people, people who survive will pressure for that sort of dialogue. Do something, whatever you want to. That's one part of the thing. The other part of the thing that I think has provide the opportunity for dialogue and peace in a more sustainable way is that finally the traditional elites split to some that said, look, there are some part of the elites whose favorite tool has been to inflate hatred and fear and to create paramilitary groups. That was one way to rule. And there is other part of the, of the elites who said, we need to build a legitimate state. That's gonna be the tool. It's not through paramilitary groups. It's through a respectable, legitimate armed force that we're gonna deal with.
And was that always in the background, that theme that, coming out of this, we are going to end up with a functional state?
Yeah, but that's a very different view. And that's ultimately, it's not how to deal with the FARC only. It's what are the sort of tools that you're gonna use? So some of them said, no, you keep this economic system which the very privileged and the exclusion of the majority. And some others will say, no, you want to build peace, you need to include people, socially, economically, and politically. If you want to build peace, you need a legitimate state with justice and reconciliation and security, but legitimate. Some others will say, maybe not, maybe paramilitary groups, that's more, it's cheaper and more effective. So the split of the elites is crucial. If you don't have that split, there are many people in Colombia the last 10 years who always told me, oh, it's so unfortunate that President Uribe and President Santos, they don't get along very well. And I say, fortunately. Otherwise, if we don't split the elites and somebody is leading the option of peace and dialogue and formalizing the state and building a democratic state and sort of a democratization process, then we will always have just the elites who want just to use force and violence and exclusion. So better they divided than united in this side. And the third thing I think is, and excuse me, I'm a political scientist, so I think we need institutions. We have very strong social institutions. The power and the resistance and the passion and the work of the civil society in Colombia, particularly, rural civil society, and social leaders who, even though they are killed and threatened, they resist and they keep doing the work that they have to do. And youth movements and women movements, which are the main survivors, the main victims, but at the same time, the main survivors. So the level of strength and passion and work that they do, that they don't resign, they resist, they build, they keep doing their political and social job, that's the other driver, right? So now we have this elite split. The state now is much stronger than before, fortunately, I think. If you think in at the beginning of the 1990s, with all this mess up, right? Drug cartels, guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups, everybody was blooming except the state. Colombia invested in 1990 less than 1% of its GDP in security and defense. That was almost an invitation to take over the state, right? So now we have the largest armed force in the region after 30 years. We didn't have even the Attorney General office 35 years ago. It didn't exist. Nobody was able to, produce a warrant against a drug lord or a guerrilla member. Nobody was able, and who tried, the brave judges who tried, they were killed. So we have now a much stronger judicial apparatus, La Defensoría del Pueblo, who is so key to build peace and to try to protect people in rural areas. It doesn't exist 35 years ago, just 30 years ago. So now we have a much stronger society, a divided elite, a stronger state, build stronger institutions, and yet, at this moment, we're not able to control 50% of our territory. We are not able. At least a fifth of Colombian population, we are talking about a 50 million people country, and we are not able to control or enforce the rights and duties for 15 million people.
So it's still vulnerable in many ways.
It's still very stateless society.
Yeah,
stateless for for a fifth of their population, right? 15 million people, 25% almost, and half of its territory. So I think that's the challenge. Now we have less violence, less illegal groups, a stronger civil society, a stronger state, a very rentistic and pre-mother economy still. So, but that's what we have now.
Yeah.
That's the goods and bads of this process. So our challenge now is how to use what we have built with so much effort through these years to be able to build reconciliation sustainably, to build economic and social inclusion, to build the social and political institutions that will be able to control legally the territory and include the population. That's the challenge we face now.
I mean, the fact that the pressure for this came from the people, as you say, pushing up.
Absolutely.
Also makes me wonder why the plebiscite failed, but let's put a pin in that, we'll come back to it.
Hatred is worse than hope sometimes, so that's why.
Nancy, as you listen to this, what occurs to you when you think about how this developed, this move forward, this evolved, this peace process with other peace processes that you've seen around the world? Uganda, perhaps, or South Africa. What strikes you?
Well, you know, as Claudia said, this was the fourth truth and justice mechanism that Colombia had put forward as Colombia tried to end 50 years of conflict. So it was extremely complex, but because of the extraordinary engagement of women, of victims of the conflict, of a lot of youth, parts of society that were motivated and activated, the resulting peace agreement with the FARC and the government is truly one of the most comprehensive and inclusive peace accords internationally. It has since run into many obstacles in the implementation, which is sadly often the case. So I wouldn't say that it currently serves as a model, but the elements of it in terms of how it balances truth with justice has the potential to be a model for international truth and reconciliation mechanisms. You know, if you look at South Africa, it was all truth and no justice. If you look at Rwanda, it was all victor's justice. What was very interesting about the FARC peace accord is that it was really one of the only times that you've had both the government forces and the FARC forces equally responsible for going in front of the justice mechanisms, telling the truth and facing sentences. Most other accords do not have that. You know, Nepal, Ivory Coast, Uganda, it's only the insurgent or the rebel forces that are put in front of those systems. Secondly,
what difference did that make, do you think?
The difference is that it is not seen as the FARC were, and this actually gets at one of the sticking points with some of the elites in Colombia that Claudia mentioned. The FARC were not seen as a defeated rebel force. It was seen as more the two sides coming together and negotiating a peace that would enable both to go forward. And so a corollary aspect was the ability of the FARC to participate in the political life of Colombia, even as they went through the justice mechanisms. That is now being contested under the new president. These are, so one of the issues is some of the really important aspects of the agreement with the new presidency are being contested, and that will be important not to reopen the agreement and invalidate some of these important agreements, especially as you look at trying to finalize the final peace agreement with the ELN, because those forces are watching very carefully what has happened to the FARC agreement. But a couple other key points is that the FARC agreement was very holistic in the way that it brought together the Memory Commission, the justice approach, the various elements that seek both truth and justice and helping victims put their stories out there and then have reparations. And it wasn't easy but it was one of the more inclusive processes where the negotiations were held in confidential negotiation sessions, but with a great deal of effort, women and victims groups and youth groups were able to be a part of the process that went forward in Havana in probably one of the more inclusive processes that we've seen internationally. And we know that that makes a difference.
Well, let's talk about that because you brought it up.
That's the result of what I was saying. I mean,
Yeah.
That's the result of the strength of civil society, even amidst war. They were able to include themselves. It's not that they were invited, at the first time table. There was the FARC and the government. And then the civil society say, hey, I don't know if you realize I'm the most important actor here. If you don't invite me, I will pressure you to include me. And they were able to do so.
That's right.
No resistance?
I mean,
yes.
a little bit resistance, of course. They were not invited
yes.
the first time, in the first place, but they were able to do it.
Yeah.
That's,
I would like to mention a special group which was very influential, first of all, in making the negotiations, having a turnover, and it was the presence of the victims. I would say both women and victims. And since the moment the victims were brought into the negotiation table, all the process kind of changed for the better, and the victims really made a total difference in the negotiation. And I would like to say that at this specific juncture, those who are really promoting forgiveness and reconciliation are the victims, and particularly those areas and those places which suffered the most of the violence. I was last week, I was in Bojayá, Chocó, having a course on forgiveness and reconciliation. And you get impressed about how much victims, those who have suffered so much, are able to understand that forgiveness is not for the victimizer, it's something good for you yourself. As Nancy was saying, sometimes victims do not want, of course, they need food and land and health and education, but they need to tell their stories.
How much was the entrance of civil society and the public needing to be inside this peace process? I mean, how much were the stories of those victims publicized and shocked Colombian society? Because I met a woman when I was down there reporting. She was kidnapped by the FARC when she was 12 years old. Her brother was trying to kind of stop the abductors. He got killed in the process. She spent time in the jungle. She married at the age of 14 a man in the jungle. They had 2 babies. She was miserable. She was doing all the women's work, in these FARC camps. And she finally managed to take her children out, on patrol one day and give them to a farmer. The farmer carried them to her mother, and at some point the year later, she escaped. But she was one of the people I met, and it just struck me that those stories must have really shocked Colombian society.
yes, it does.
Did it bring the energy of the people and civil society? Is that what gave them a seat at the table?
That's part of it, undoubtedly. That's part of it. And of course, you are, in a country such as Colombia, you are plenty. I mean, you have millions of such stories of the victims of military forces, victims of paramilitary groups, victims of drug traffickers, of guerrillas. I mean, you're plenty. You hear this all the time.
Yeah.
So to some extent, it shocks and it creates empathy and solidarity. But to some extent, it also becomes like, that's life.
Yeah.
That's sort of normalized.
White
thing.
noise.
It causes both things at the same time. But what I will say, and regarding your point about the plebiscite, because you can say, well, Colombia is this country in which you ask, after 60 years of war, if you want to end it, and the majority says no. So we deserve the credit for crazy ones in the world, of course. But at the same time,
You're not the only ones.
it's not that easy. It's not that people, first of all, 63% of the people didn't even care to vote.
Yeah.
Like, that's not my issue. You know? Yeah, I mean, if you ask me, you want to end the war? Yes, of course, I want to end the war. You know, somebody has to end it. It doesn't have to be with my current life, my needs, my challenges and stuff. And about the third that actually voted, it was quite a split. You know, the difference were 40,000 votes among 30 million votes. But it shows how not important for most of the country it is. You know, the war is something that is happening in the rural areas for very poor people, ethnic people you don't recognize, you don't have friends with, you don't have ties with. It's something far away. It's like looking at war in Uganda. It's very much the same. I mean, having war in Caquetá or in Putumayo or in Nariño, which are regions in Colombia, is like from Bogota point of view or Medellin point of view or Cali point of view. It's like looking at a war in Uganda. It's almost the same thing. So there are not actually ties to that. And you have to understand that because it's so easy to judge, to say, oh, what kind of people is this one? They don't care. They don't have empathy. They don't have solidarity. What kind of monsters they are? No, they are common people, nice, good people, decent people, trying to work, who's only saying, take care of my needs. You may build peace, you may end war, you can reconcile people, you can include the poor, you can take the cares of the peasants and the indigenous people and women, and that's great, but take care of my needs too. I am an urban, middle-class Colombian. I don't have these ethnic issues in general. What I want is employment, fight corruption, give me good education, and so on and so forth. So I think that was the wake-up call. You have 3 different countries within one. The urban middle-class Colombia, the poor, rural, ethnic, exclude Colombia. It's 2 different worlds, and someone in the middle, right? So I think for myself, which I've been fighting for peace since I was 16 years old, I'm 48 now. And the wake-up call with the plebiscite was like, wow. And I was politician at that moment. I was senator. I visited 4 more times places in Colombia campaigning for peace than campaigning for myself. It was the saddest day in my life, the plebiscite day. Like, how could the no win? But at the same time, I said, there is something I don't understand. And I pretend that's my job. My job is to represent and to understand the needs and hopes of the Colombian people, the entire 50 million people. And clearly, I'm not understanding the challenges and hopes of at least half of them. So I have to do better my job. I need to understand what they want. How can I involve them through peace in a less polarized way? And I think that's what we are doing now. It's not taking care of peace, it's not abandoning the peace agenda, but it's understanding that the only way in which at least half of the society in Colombia is willing to take the peace within its agenda is if we, the society, the rest of society, the peace lovers, the peacemakers, understand also that they have different needs and they want also those needs to be part of the main agenda.
I'm going to go to a few questions, but one more thought from Nancy. The new President Duque was in Washington recently. What did he say? Is he supporting this peace process? Does it look like he's on the side of peace? Because it's not always clear with him.
Well, he came very soon after his election, which I think was quite wise of him, to meet with many members of Congress who, there's been deep engagement from Washington in Colombia for a number of years in an effort to help Colombia emerge from these many cycles of conflict. And so I think he's done a good job of creating support, and he is certainly talking about the importance of both continuing the ELN peace negotiations and moving forward the FARC agreements. There are, however, several provisions of the FARC agreement that are being contested, some of which the Constitutional Court really has the jurisdiction, and hopefully that will move forward as agreed upon. So he's saying a lot of the right things, but there are certain elements that are hanging in the balance that will need to be carefully moved through, and you know, how do you continue to make the agreement amenable politically while not undercutting the core tenets such that the FARC will walk away thinking that it's been undercut. So I think we're at a moment right now where it could go forward, where I'm more hopeful than before the election, but it's a critical moment. I'm sure my colleagues have thoughts on this from inside Colombia.
I guess before I ask a question from the audience, I mean, what are the big political risks inside Colombia right now? Where is the thinnest ice for this peace agreement?
Well, I will say that the first political risk is that you have a young, moderate, center-right president who was elected by a far-right leader. How to deal with that, you know, ambiguity is hard for them and hard for the country, and that's the risk. So he, you know, President Duque, I met with him, we were both senators in the same term. So I know he's moderate, I know he's, you know, a well-intended person, but 1 year ago, nobody knew who was Ivan Duque. Nobody knew. So let's be clear. Álvaro Uribe won the elections, period. He's the one who rules. He's the one having the electoral and political power. And he is not as moderate and as young, as well-intended as Ivan Duque is. And that's the risk. How much Ivan Duque, as president himself, will be able to navigate between the waters of the far right who elected him, the moderate right who also elected him, how to deal with the, you know, the center left and left who didn't elect him.
And
so far he's saying all the nice things. Yeah. He says the nice things. He says what Lisa wants to hear and everybody wants to hear here. But he cannot change, he cannot meet his words. He cannot meet those goals. He cannot meet those standards. He clearly doesn't have the political power to do that. And I think that's the challenge. So far the Constitutional Court, I would say, all the peace accords with the FARC has already been upheld in 96% by the Constitutional Court. So it's not a constitutional legal issue. It's not, that's not the challenge. Most of the peace agreement and the peace accords will survive the constitutional review. 96% is already gone. It's only 4% dealing with. The problem is political. Is to meet such a comprehensive role model agreements needs political change, electoral change, economic change, and you have empowered those who doesn't want the status quo rather than the change. So that's the difficulty, right? That's the paradox.
You're going to run again?
Probably.
Really? Yeah. I'm thinking, I mean, need to ensure that stays on the right track.
I think in Oslo people will vote for me. That's good news. That's a good start.
An odd absentee ballot. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions from the audience, and feel free to, anybody grab them, but I think maybe, Leonel, this first one for you. How do Colombian youth feel about the peace accords?
Gosh, that's a good question, because I particularly feel that the future of our peace is in the hands of the youth, and I would add, in the hands of women. I think young people and women are understanding more than anybody else the need of peace through reconciliation. Our big risk at this moment, Marco, is that those who are kind of supporting punitive justice, which is hate and revenge, those who are not only political leaders, they are also financial leaders. The big risk is that they prevail over those of us who believe in restorative justice. instead, I said, of punitive justice. And I think this is the great divide at this moment in Colombia. Thank you.
This question for Senator Claudia Lopez. How do you think the Congress and the new administration of Ivan Duque will defeat corruption from politicians into the Colombian government, since this is a main issue that has remained for decades and it does not allow peace? And is there any way to make the Consulta Popular Anticorrupción possible, even though it did not succeed at the polls?
Well, let me give a little bit of context for the audience.
Sure.
To answer that. So we have this plebiscite for peace. 13 million participate, and the no wins won. Now, 2 years later, making this sort of reflection that I was mentioning before, like why I didn't understand. How can I want to be a positive, constructive leader in Colombia. I come from the urban middle class, but I absolutely understand that if we are not able to include the poor and excluded peasants and ethnic groups in my country, which has the more excluded, more poor, the poorer, the more excluded, the politically underrepresented, there is no future for Colombia. That's my assessment. So how can I sort of reconcile and unite both agendas, both people, both groups? What could be the topic that unite us instead of divided us? Because clearly how to deal with the peace with the FARC divided us enormously. So I tried with another topic. I said, well, let's bring two issues: fighting inequality and fighting corruption. And ultimately, Colombia is, well, one of we're always in the worst ranks in the transparency areas in the world and in the region. And it clearly has to do, it impedes, this level of political economic corruption impedes equality, because you cannot provide public goods of good enough quality, health and education stuff, that people need to include themselves in the market. It forbids and impedes to create a more competitive market economy, which is the one in which I believe. Yeah. And it also keeps in power the worst of the political leaders of this country. So it has a lot of impacts. Let's put that on the agenda and see if we can do better to unite more people. And we propose a popular consultation against a kind of plebiscite, but not for peace, but to fight against corruption. 7 specific measures that we put people to vote on. So it requires both the plebiscite and the plebiscite for peace and the plebiscite against corruption requires an enormous level of participation. 36 million people can vote in Colombia. Let me be clear. At least 15 million of them never ever vote. Never ever. Right. So you don't actually. It's not 26 million people. The most you can hope that people actually will vote is 21, because 15 million never ever in the 20th or 21st century actually vote, for different reasons. So let's take that out of the picture. So your actual potential is 21 million voters. 13 million voters participated in the plebiscite for peace, and the no won by 6.5, more than 6.5. Now, 2 years later, we do this plebiscite, anti-corruption plebiscite. 11.7 million people participate, 11.4 voted for the yes to the 7 measures. So we went up, from my point of view, neither the plebiscite, either this one or this one didn't reach the level of people who you need to participate to make them enforceable legally. But politically, they are a mandate, of course. We renegotiate the peace agreement because the no won. So we are democracy. We have to renegotiate the peace agreement. It was rejected, it was renegotiated, and then it was approved, not in the polls, but in Congress. Right. What about the plebiscite against anti-corruption forces? It needed 12.2 million voters to be enforceable legally. It only won 11.7. But 11.4 voted yes for the 7 measures. So we went from 6 million people voting yes in the peace agreement to 11.4 million people voting yes, agreement for something. 99% of the yes won. So we are sort of reaching out how to build these 2 agendas and these 2 countries together. What happens now? I'm not hopeful. I mean, what happens is that everybody says, I want to this conclusion. I was the leader of this anti-corruption plebiscite. And I came to the conclusion that the very supporters, people who sympathize with our cause and the cause, they thought that we were able to get maybe 7 or 8 million. That was their measure of success. People who's against us politically thought that maybe at the most we're going to get like 4 million voters in the votes in the anti-corruption plebiscite. So they were all, the supporters and the contestants, they were all surprised. Like 11.7 million people vote with the no involvement of any party, no support of any political leader. I mean, I've been just 4 years in politics. I'm not a big politician in Colombia or whatever.
You've been fighting for a long time.
I'm fighting for the long term.
Yeah.
But, so no parties involved, no political leaders. Alvaro Uribe was against of it, right? Directly and personally. No gamonales or nobody was buying votes to convince people to vote, which is like 1/3 part of the Colombian votes are buying. And even though, against all expectations, almost 12 million people went to vote with the only motivation of their own conscience, period. That's quite a success. So what happens is, President Duque says, oops, that's 1.5 million people more than voted for him. I mean, 10 million people elected President Duque, 12 million people almost voted the anti-corruption measures. So he says, well, I have to take that agenda into account. He invited us to build a national pact agreement to pass in Congress the 7 measures that people voted for. We're negotiating the text in these 2 weeks. We're going to put that before Congress next week, and it has to be approved in the next year. It has to be approved because we're going to organize outside of Congress. Not that I have the hope that suddenly Congress is these pristine institutions who want transparency in Colombia. No, is that the majority in Congress is still very corrupt people, but they are elected, 16 million people elect the entire Congress, Yeah. So any party in Congress now, from the left, from the right, from the center, knows that the majority of their voters voted for the anti-corruption measures. So if they want to survive, they have to take care of it. They have to respond to these demands. And we're going to build an enormous civil society pressure over Congress and the government in the next year for that to happen. So I'm hopeful in that sense.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to ask them. This one I'm going to send to you, Nancy. We've been talking about Colombia and the changes that have been made there, but how can you and I make those changes in other countries, Israel, Jerusalem in particular? I went for the big one.
Yeah. I don't think in the 4 minutes we have left we can really answer that, other than to just note that.
But are there elements of what you've been hearing today that you think could be instrumental in, the peace process in the Mideast? It's so not even on the table anymore. But
it's not, and we just celebrated, or I should say, noted. The anniversary of the Oslo peace process earlier this week, which obviously has stumbled and fizzled miserably.
Yeah.
So we don't really have the core elements on the table that would lead one to the kind of agreement that we've been talking about in Colombia. And you also have a process that's enormously complicated by external actors. So to that end, you know, what could you or I do is to register our thoughts and opinions with our elected officials as to what we would like the United States to do in terms of helping that process to be resuscitated. And you know, it's further complicated by very difficult politics inside Israel, corruption and ineptitude inside the Palestinian Authority. And one thing that we've seen is within both within the Israelis and within the Palestinians, they have each become more fragmented. And so when you have fragmentation on both sides of that kind of a conflict, that makes it even harder to come to the table. So we can certainly encourage both sides to do their own reconciliation internally. We can register with the United States government, which definitely has a role, our desire for the U.S. to be a positive and constructive player in moving forward a peace process.
Final question for you, Lionel, and maybe everybody has a thought on this. Regarding the political economy of hate, do you think it's a growing trend in politics worldwide? We think of the 2016 U.S. election and what's been unleashed from that, Brexit, which had a very strong anti-immigration kind of component to it. How do you think it's going to change the future of global politics?
Gosh.
Another
If you allow me just to say two main thoughts. The first one is that instead of going out to other countries, which, as we know, are also cultivating hate, like, for instance, Venezuela, we are so sad about Venezuela at this moment. And we would really like to send an appeal to the American people also to try to reinforce the support and help assistance to Venezuela. But you know, I feel that the strong divide along the racial lines here in the USA needs also urgent action. And I think I've been here in the States several times, and I think Americans need reconciliation. And my final consideration is, please do not let arms go into the classrooms. Let me say, arms are for revenge. We have to use, as the leftist guerrilla has taught us in Colombia, that from now on, their only arms will be their words. Words are for reconciliation, arms are for revenge. And humbly, as a Colombian citizen, I have to say, we are laying our arms. Perhaps it's a time also for Americans to lay down their arms. Thank you.
I have one final question, and that's to bring us back to where we started, and that is the reason we're all here to talk about the Nobel Peace Prize. Did the awarding of the Peace Prize to Santos, did that help change or move the needle at all with the doubters of the peace process in Colombia? It is a prestigious prize. It makes international news every year on the BBC as soon as they start awarding these. It's really important. So what did that mean to the people of Colombia who may not have been so invested or even convinced that this was the right thing to do?
It is the total support to what I'm just trying to say. I mean, the Nobel Prize meant for us that the whole world is supporting the peace process instead of the war process.
But were Colombians convinced?
I think 50-50, yes. 51.
But it was an important international signal, that kind of leadership, because he did take risks with the FARC negotiations, that it's valued, that it's recognized, and hopefully it's an inspiration for other leaders who have that choice to make.
Yeah. I think it was important. I think it was deserved. President Santos undoubtedly deserved the prize. But I think the leaders of the FARC also deserve the prize. So it was an incomplete prize. There is no peace agreement made on one person or one side. Any peace agreement has two sides. And at least it would have been probably more, irritating for the 50% of the country, but it could have been more hopeful and strength for the other 51% of the country who supports this. So it was incomplete, but it was well-deserved, and I appreciate and always grateful for the level of support and recognition that our peace process has in the world.
Claudia Lopez, Leonel Narvaez, and Nancy Lindbergh, thank you very much for this stimulating conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're always.
Good morning. Before we head out to the next sessions, I see some folks are doing that already. I just want to say a few quick words about logistics. My name is Joe Underhill. I'm the program director for the Nobel Peace Prize Forum. Thank you, Lionel. I just want to thank again our panelists and moderator for this great session this morning and engaging us in some really deep investigation and questioning about the peace process in Colombia. As you head out into the day and the rest of your sessions, just note that the next set of panels will begin at 11:15. You should check your little printed schedules or the guidebook app for locations. We have an amazing array of speakers coming up. So you'll have the sort of fortunate challenge of having to make some tough choices, but they're all amazing panelists and speakers. So good luck with that. While you're out in the hall here, please check out the water bar. You'll note that there are a number of programs and panels today that relate to the theme of water. We have the paradox of peace and the paradox of water that we're engaging. So one part of that is the arts programming, and so you can check out that at the end of the atrium here. We will meet back here at 3:30 for the closing plenary with Maya Sotero-Ng, Armanta, Jutescat Martinez, Isa Rosk-Marzon. So please come back at 3:30. Following that, there'll be the peace meal in the quad across the way if you have tickets for that. If you don't, there's other restaurants and dining options in the neighborhood here. Check the information in your guidebook app as well. So enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll see you back here at 3:30. Thanks very much.